Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 15th Annual MIT CDOIQ Symposium. This is the breakout session, session 9C. Today, we're pleased to have a speaker who's been with us several times before and always does a great presentation, Justin Magruder from SAIC. Justin will be talking about the practical application for the Positive Data Control Framework. Justin, it's a pleasure to have you with us again, and I will hand it over to you.
Thanks, Robert. Let me see if I can share my screen. And there we go. Can you see my screen, Robert?
We can do indeed, yes.
Excellent, excellent. Let's get started. The first thing I'd like to do is introduce my colleagues. First of all, my mentor and a professor and advisor of mine, Dr. John Talbert, who's also been, I think, at the conference once or twice before, and Dr. Daniel Pullen, who's a partner of mine at SAIC and is our lead data architect and data scientist. Dr. Talbert and Daniel, welcome. I'm going to step through a couple of slides that describe the myData framework for positive data control. We've been working at SAIC and in the academic world with Dr. Talbert and a number of his colleagues, Dr. Wang, with the Symposium and a few others on this program. And we want to describe our approach, our solution, and then I think we're going to throw the gauntlet down at the end of the call and talk about ways to use this approach to solve challenges like the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, or CMMC. Some of you have thought about it. First of all, about SAIC. SAIC is, some of you may know us. We're a Fortune 400 company. We serve federal businesses, agencies, departments, primarily in the financial, healthcare, defense, and national intelligence sectors. We are known as a software integrator, and we've worked on some pretty interesting projects. And from a data point of view, we do some pretty cool stuff. I'm just going to see if I can pull this off quickly and toggle to give you a little background about
It's been said
SAIC.
that the best way to predict the future is to create it. For over 50 years, SAIC has embraced the unknown, mission-focused to build a tomorrow that works for everyone. Bold transformations, digital ingenuity, the explosive, thrillingly awesome power of tech. So no matter what the future holds, we're ready to bring on tomorrow.
There we go. That's a little more about SAIC, and I'd be happy to talk about that later in the call or after this discussion. Our objective today is to describe the business case and the framework for a concept called positive data control, and for the methods with which to establish positive data control in the enterprise. We're going to step through, we have a lot of slides, so I'm going to move relatively quickly. But the first is the business case. Why even do this? And I think we've put together some information that should be compelling. I'm going to start with some work by a fellow classmate in the doctoral program at UALR under Dr. Talbert, and Yanbin Yi in his abstract wrote about the case for positive data control. And the reality is that data governance requirements and active data governance requirements are usually not really a key consideration during system design. And as it happens, most programs manage metadata, data quality after the fact. It's not a prerequisite in many systems design and systems implementation programs. And so changes to data and metadata and the infrastructure for systems are often an afterthought. Usually quality is addressed after and through remediation in operational systems. And I think the solution, we think, is to implement those active data governance controls and frameworks prior to or during system design rather than afterwards. And we think it's the only way to effectively implement solutions required for things like the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. For those of you in particular in the defense business, you know that CMMC is a looming requirement, and it's quite a challenge. And later on in this discussion, we're going to throw a gauntlet down. And Robert, I hope come back to you in a year and see if anyone has stood up to our challenge.
Sure. Yeah.
So the problem statement, I love this slide. It was put together by Sarah Jones on our team. And it describes in most enterprises, the challenges with the lack of data governance. And what we see in many companies is the proliferation of systems with information and the need for integration of data through probably the world's most powerful analytic tool, Microsoft Excel. We see Excel and documents in CSVs and other forms being used to share data across an enterprise. And we see the same behavior. And I've spent most of my career in financial services with several large financial organizations. And this is true, just as true there as I found it may be true in some of our customers and at big companies like SAIC. We find that information is all over the place, and you have to have sort of a tribal knowledge to put together answers to basic questions and to make sure that the answers to those questions are the same answers that the person next to you might get, were they to ask similar or the same questions. So what we see is a framework that we need to begin to assemble for data governance. At the top of the framework, you can see, of course, the most important thing is partners and partnerships. We can't do this in a vacuum. We need to work outside of IT with our business partners, and data governance is effectively a business requirement and a business process. We see the structure of the team and the implementation of strategic and tactical projects as and the prioritization of those projects as a key requirement. And then at the base of the governance framework, we see the standards, the policies, and the procedures that need to be documented and implemented and managed by this triangle in the center, the steering committee, the governance board or boards, and the working groups and active data governance stewards. So we see positive data control as the next generation method for managing data governance. In other words, remember Dr. Talbert telling me a few years ago that we ought to be able to automate all of data governance. And the question is, how do you do that? And we believe it's through a framework like positive data control, which, as you'll see in a few minutes, is quite compelling. So we looked at a number of use cases for this discussion and in some of our work in the field and in our organization. We think about financial planning and analysis, and that's really a fundamental element of every company and every organization that I've worked with. Understanding where you are, where you've been, and where you're going in a financial sense is critical to staying in business. Human capital management, we know, is the foundation of business. We need our people. We need our people to be, we need to know what their skills and certifications are, their experience and qualifications. We need to manage their career. We need to help them understand that we're here to partner with our staff and make sure that they are successful and that they make us successful in the company. And finally, we've thought about data asset management and how do we manage the identification of assets and the valuations of those assets. As Dr. Talbert likes to say, the real question around data quality is what value does it bring to the organization? And forgive me, Dr. Talbert, that's a little a version of what you've told me many times. So we're going to talk about positive data control. And what positive data control does is it employs a framework of commodity systems that we're all becoming familiar or are familiar with. So cataloging and active metadata for all of the data in the company, in the organization. We need to understand a glossary and all of the active transformations that are described in the company's analytics. So we think about things like profit. It turns out profit might have 20 or 30 different definitions. We think about ratios in the consulting business like time to hire. What does time to hire mean? Does it mean just that time from when you take a job requisition and close a deal to hire someone, or is it something bigger? So we're going to talk about this in the context of a couple of use cases we'll introduce in a few minutes. But first, we're going to step through the rationale for the positive data control. And we're going to talk about this chart on the right, which is a cartoonish version of the architecture we've developed. And we're going to talk about what the real secret sauce is in that control layer. So Dr. Talbert, over to you.
Thank you, Justin. I appreciate it. The opportunity to talk about this. This is something that I've been working on, thinking about for a long time. And it really grows out of my experience in working with many organizations trying to implement data governance. And we have a lot of lofty goals for data governance. One of them being, that we're going to know exactly where all the data in our organization are located and what's in it. And we're going to adhere to a certain set of policies that will help us stay within the guidelines or the guardrails of our company's risk management. And so, but in most of those cases, and I know many of you that are watching this realize that you often have to kind of pull back from that aspiration and say, well, we're just going to catalog our most important data. And most people rely on auditing and basically employee loyalty to adhere to or comply with policies. So there's a great deal of need for more automation to make more of these things done automatically in a controlled way. And so that's really what positive data control is about. It's really about automating many of the functions of data governance that are left to be manually mediated right now. So basically it's defining what we call a controlled space where we actually control the data, but not only control the data, but we control what people can do with that data in that control space. This is kind of where we've made a lot of advances in data security. And so there's a lot of, we all have to go through multi-factor authentication and many things to get to data. But the problem is now that once we get to data, we don't have much control about what people can actually do with it. So there's basically two parts to this. One is really tracking everything that goes on, all the data, where it is, what's in it, and then, what people can do with data once they have access to it. So next slide, Justin. So there's many aspects of it, and Daniel's going to talk more about the details of it, but basically you need a control layer that recognizes the users, but not only the users, but the transformations that they have access to. And of course, a very key is the metadata and the catalog, because again, one of the primary aims is to have a way to keep your catalog up to date, real time, with all the data, not just what you think is important data or data that you think your analytics team needs access to. That's really the real goal. I remember one of the earlier MIT conferences that I came to, I went to a session by Chubb Insurance. A guy was giving a talk and saying, why can't we insure data? They were, Doug Laney and others were always talking about data as an asset. And so the insurance people were explaining, well, yeah, it's an asset, but we can't really insure it because you can't tell us where it is. You don't know what you have. You can't give us an inventory of all of your data. So one of the main goals of positive data control is to actually have a way to automate keeping up with, in detail, not just what we think is important, but every scratch pad that gets built and gets deleted. So everything is always up to date in real time. And then once you have this ecosystem, this closed ecosystem, then of course you need a way to get data in and out of it, and potentially to exchange with other people. If this were to really catch on and other people were using positive data control systems, they need a way to exchange data with each other. And as Justin and I are members of the U.S. Technical Advisory Group to ISO, we're very big into the ISO standards. And there's a good standard for data exchange that can be used in the positive data control framework. So this is sort of our vision, and what we would really like to do is really around automating those aspects of data governance that are so hard to execute right now. And with that, I'm gonna turn it back over to you, Justin.
Thanks, Dr. Talbert. I think the next set of slides, Daniel, go to you to help us understand how positive data control works.
Thank you, Justin and Dr. Talbot both for laying the foundation. I'm going to talk a bit about how positive data control works. Of course, we have a finite amount of time, so we'll keep the discussion at a higher level. You may remember this diagram from the slide that Justin showed earlier. And this is kind of a logical way of thinking about all the components and pieces within positive data control. And so we really see, this is a larger umbrella, as Justin sort of implied earlier, that, of course, your traditional structured systems that you would use a data catalog in today's world, for example, as well as extending to unstructured document repositories and things like that, which is really a hot topic for CMMC activities, especially around CUI. And so, in how we want to get to that, there are a couple of different parts and pieces that, fit into this bigger picture. And so some of those tools and processes that are really important, for example, is, focusing on attribute-based access controls and getting away from group or role-based access controls, which, in that discussion about automation that Dr. Talbot was talking about, helps automate the access control implementation process and gives you more granular, more sophisticated controls over how users and systems access the data in the company. Part of that, as far as document discovery, as Dr. Talbot was talking about, understanding, where are your data assets and having good visibility and provenance over them. So, especially in the context of unstructured documents, network scanners are really important. Scanners in the context of structured data, I think, are fairly well established in the data catalog ecosystem today. It's less so the case with unstructured data at the enterprise level. And then a catalog, and when we think about a catalog, we're not talking about just today's world where we have catalogs that are focused on structured data, but also extending those capabilities to really think about documents and other unstructured data sources in the enterprise. And so thinking about comprehensive metadata, as well as vectors and really relationships to, who's authoring these documents, who are accessing them and modifying them, et cetera, things like that. And getting to, a centralized one-click access to reports around access, really thinking about auditability, but also, having that trail of how changes happen to documents and data within the company. And really positive data control, it helps automate, proactive data governance, as Dr. Howard was talking about, increases efficiency of operations by reducing manual intervention and manual touch points in the processes, and reduces data risks for the company. And we'll talk about all these items over on the right in the subsequent slides as well, and how they fit in the picture. Next slide, please, Justin. All right, so first, we like to think of this, that this is where the magic happens. So the control layer is really a foundational piece of the approach that we're taking for, getting to these outcomes that we've discussed. And it's really, in a lot of ways, the glue as well as a control layer. And so it's the thing that connects, the data catalog. It connects the metadata repository that may sound like a data catalog, but I think there's a bit of a distinction there. Data catalogs tend to be, I would say, not very transactional in their design, whereas when we think about positive data control, you need a metadata repository that's very capable of, transactional, low latency collection of metadata. You can think of, imagine if you have a team of data modelers working on enterprise data, all subsequently, across multiple systems in the company. There's a lot of metadata that's produced by those activities, whether it's transformations to the data or whether it's access, and even just, querying and viewing the data. And then the transformation tools, which is how we interact with the data. So we might use, in a relational database, we might use SQL to query the data, or to view it or to transform it. And we think about more modern technologies, like distributed systems in the Hadoop ecosystem, or in systems that are sort of in that bigger domain, like Databricks, or some of the offerings from Azure, et cetera, EMR, on the AWS ecosystem, Snowflake, et cetera. We might be using other tools like PySpark, for example, use Python for transformations, or even using Java code or Scala code in some cases. And then the data storage space, and this is where the data lives. And as I'm sure many of you can imagine, there are many different tools and systems we can use to store data. That may be relational databases like SQL Server or Microsoft SQL Server, Oracle, or they may be more modern technologies like Hive or even Delta Lake and distributed systems and many others. And so these are really the four components that they kind of plug into the control layer. Next slide, please, Justin. So let's talk a bit more about the data catalog. This is, one of the ways we refer to this is the control catalog, and that this contains a lot of really, rich and useful metadata about not only the data assets, but also the systems and the users that interact with those data assets. And of course, the traditional data catalog features, a list of data elements, of course, that are in different data assets. Then we think as we start to kind of straddle the line over on the business side from the technical side, thinking about glossary of critical data elements, and depending on your catalog, you may have different semantics you use to refer to those. And then a complete collection, and this is really critical from the business view, complete collection of enterprise reports for business areas in the company, and starting at business intelligence and growing into more sophisticated use cases when you think about data science. Next slide, please. And the metadata repository, I talked about this a bit earlier. So I want to emphasize, two pieces here that I sort of already touched on. So, active metadata with persistence. And one of the key pieces of that is a real-time synchronization. So as users or systems are interacting with data and manipulating it, transforming it, whatever the semantics are you want to describe it, that changes the metadata, whether it's from an auditing perspective or if it's a part of the core structure of the data. And as those changes happen, one of the big value adds of this whole concept is to automate the collection of that. So as that's happening in real time, collect those and push those changes to a very transactional, very active metadata repository, and then in a very short amount of time, synchronizing those with an enterprise data catalog so that users can benefit and immediately see those changes reflected. Next slide, please. And then the transformations, as I talked about. So this is complete inventory of what we call controlled transformations, and they have linkage to data elements, of course, and then on the business side, really the critical data elements, and thinking even going into like a business glossary and understanding how transformations may affect how the business views those data, especially thinking about from like a reporting perspective, as I touched on in the previous slide. We may have transformations that change definitions of how we view data points that reflect company operations or the status of the company. And transformations, I'll throw this out. I think, the controlled transformations are potentially one of the tricky components. And I think when I talk about this with technical people, there's immediate concern that is, I can't use the tools that I want to interact with my data. And I see kind of like two use cases here that I think most of us can relate to. If you're using a business intelligence platform, you're using Power BI or maybe Tableau for enterprise level reporting, there's generally a consumption use case there. So people are viewing data. And I think that's in the realm of scope, it's not a very sophisticated use case. Access controls and then viewing is really the primary scope. When you think about transformations or development of data models and things like that, it gets much more tricky. So one of the key pieces here that I'm trying to get to that I want to emphasize is that you still have to enable developers and data modelers and data scientists and whoever's really curating and building your data and getting it into a state that's really valuable for the company. They have to be able to use the tools that meet their requirements and their needs. And so that's one of the real challenges in this area in particular. Next slide, please. And then talk quickly about data segments. So I alluded that in the data space, there are many different systems that our data lives in a company, especially at the enterprise level of any company of a decent size. And they may be, some of the examples I used previously may be traditional relational databases, such as Microsoft SQL Server, Oracle. They may be, in some cases, could be, source system reporting. You have like Cognos, for example, tends to be a reporting mechanism that's coupled very closely to systems. But then you may have enterprise reporting as well, like Power BI. And you may have more modern distributed solutions, as I talked about. You may be using Spark for doing distributed data pipelines and things like that. A number of other tools that help reduce the burden to do that. On Azure, you have Azure Data Factory. You have Airflow, the open source ecosystem, Apache Airflow, or you may be looking at other really amazing toolkits like DataIQ out there, for example. And so all of these represent, places where data can be coming from. And it's critical that the positive data control system has the ability to, be sufficiently abstract that it can cover all of these different, sources and sinks that exist within, an enterprise level data pipeline or architecture. Next slide. And then this is just a high level view of sort of what this looks like. And I want to emphasize a couple points around this. So you'll see that there's kind of two pieces that are inside the dotted lines. And so we think those dotted lines as being the controlled space. And within that, we have those data systems that are the controlled data spaces or the segments. And then you have users that interact with those systems in that controlled space. So, obviously they're not physically in that controlled space, but, if we think about it in a logical concept, they never leave that system. So when they're interacting with it, it's completely in control, or I like to think of it closes the loop. So everything that happens in here is being, is satisfying all of those conditions that were set forth earlier. And then on the boundaries, outside users, outside of the control system, they can't interact with the data, they cannot manipulate it. And so this not only ensures that, that loop on the metadata collection is closed, but also ensures that only authorized people have access to the data. And then you'll see on the boundaries of this control system, there's integrations and interactions with enterprise level identity and access controls. There's also interaction with the enterprise data catalog that I talked about earlier. And then there need to be mechanisms to import and export data out of the control system. We may bring in data from third parties into our company. We may want to share our data with third parties, or we may have other systems in the company that are not under control for business reasons. And so we need, a mechanism to import and export out of the system in a manner that's compliant with some ISO standards. And next slide, I think that's my section. Justin, back to you.
Thanks, Daniel. That was awesome. And stick around because we may, let's kind of leave our mics open for the next couple of discussions around use cases. We're going to talk about two very relevant use cases in the next section. And we're going to gloss over one of them because it's not as fun as the second one. But I'm going to start with the first use case. And we've alluded to it a couple of times. And this is the cybersecurity maturity model certification process based upon NIST 800, 171, and 172, and some guidance by the NARA and the DoD and a few other departments and agencies in the executive branch. Basically, the CMMC framework is designed to help the US federal government protect information that is controlled and unclassified. There are 126 types of controlled unclassified information. The DoD has done a very good job of putting together training materials and information so that, and it's all in the public domain. And it's quite a fascinating subject, but it's complicated. And we believe a patchwork approach is the only way to effectively implement this solution, which brings us to positive data control, because we believe positive data control is that approach. It's not a patchwork, it's really a fabric. And we can talk about that. But we wanted to take today to lay out, to throw down a gauntlet and challenge anyone who's participating in this sector and interested in this subject to come back with us next year to this event, assuming that Robert and Rich and the rest of the team decide that this is interesting. We think it's fascinating because we think we have a solution to this challenge based upon some of the discussions Dr. Talbert and Dr. Pullen mentioned. And we believe that every large heterogeneous environment organization has this challenge today and has to find a way to address this challenge. We've spent a lot of time talking with some very smart people at Gartner and very smart people at Forrester and some other consulting organizations that help us understand what the industry is doing. Dr. Talbert and Dr. Pullen have led us through the academic world. We've done quite a bit of research and determined that what's out there doesn't really address this problem the way positive data control does. And so we'd like to see everybody in a year, and would hope that maybe some other colleagues in this space have interesting solutions. But I think we'll be back with an answer to the question, and we think we have a compelling approach. But in the meantime, we thought we'd do something more fun. So we want to talk about movies. Everybody loves movies, I think, especially post-pandemic or during the pandemic. I know I saw more movies in the last 18 months than I've probably seen my entire life, because there was not much else to do when we weren't doing our work. So we were spending a few months early this year and late last year, Daniel and I and Dr. Talbert and a few teammates, and we'll mention them later, and a good old friend of ours from Microsoft, an architect named Chris Colthrust. Chris gave us a good assist, and we were trying to come up with a use case for positive data control that was meaningful, but was easy to understand. And so we looked at the movie industry, and we thought, hey, you know, there's a rating system that the Motion Picture Association has put together that describes ratings for movies and applies or assigns ratings to movies based upon the acceptability in the eyes of the MPAA for parents to interpret the appropriateness of these movies for children, for their children. So most of us know this framework. G-rated movies are really for anyone, and they're usually relatively benign content and happy stories. PG movies, those are for, the industry suggests that parents, you know, observe what their children under the age of 13 are doing, and keep an eye on the movies that are PG rated. PG-13 are ones that are explicitly for people over the age of 13 or 13 and older. R-rated movies are restricted and usually have some adult-related content. And then finally, NC-17, there are some other names for that, but NC-17 would be movies that have adult content and are not appropriate for children. So we decided this was a pretty good framework. And so we went out and to see if we could find some open data. We went to Kaggle, which has some great open data sets, and we found some data from the Box Office Mojo, which is one of the websites that aggregates movie data. And we thought, well, this would be a good use case. And the data was open, so we could use it. So we pulled the data in, and we decided to figure out how the positive data control framework would operate in this MPAA ratings case. So we realized that we would have to prove that we could manage access controls, we'd have to be able to mask or encrypt certain data. And so we needed both RBAC and ABAC frameworks. We wanted to have good metadata for grouping of the movies. So the ratings framework gave us that. But we needed to figure out how to come up with a second key dimension to describe the way those ratings could be applied. Because we wanted to have a situation where some users could see sensitive content and others could be restricted from that. So we came up with the access control framework. Daniel, do you want to talk about this for a second? I know I'm kind of surprising you here, but you and I put this together the other day. Can you walk through these two charts?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, as Justin sort of already described, the MPAA rating is, a great example that I think everyone can relate to, and it's easy to get your head around. And here we just have sort of a simplified view. We just looked at 3 of the MPAA ratings, and then looked at in our subset of users where we sort of just, again, this is sort of just proving out some of these concepts. They were essentially, 10 years old, 16 years old, and greater than 18. But you can see how those would sort of relate back to the MPAA ratings that we're all familiar with. I think most of us are probably familiar with, and that Justin briefly described. And we can see these as here you have an attribute characteristics that are associated with the user, and attribute characteristic that's associated with the movie in this case, which is what the data is about. And then if we look down below, we're looking at some roles, and of course, roles could also be attributes in this model as well. And so thinking about different roles that an individual may have in accessing this data, and we just came up with 4 simple roles: an executive, at the company, an intern that's doing research for the company, a child that's viewing the data, and then a third-party researcher in this example. And these tables really just sort of describe how those controls overlay between the attribute descriptions from the data and then the attribute descriptions for the users. And so just to give a material example, if you look at R, you were saying in this example, they have to be 18 or older. In the case of PG, the 10-year-old cannot see it. Justin talked about, some parental guidance is advised for children under the age of 13, for example. And then, of course, for G, everyone can see G-rated movies because they're for a general audience.
Thanks, Daniel. So what we did is then we developed 4 personas, and they were one of the axes on the lower chart on the previous page. But we came up with persona number 1, which was a user who should have unfettered access to the data. So a studio executive who might be one of the members of the MPAA, clearly over 18, and somebody who needed to be able to use the data for deep research and for marketing and strategic planning purposes. The second persona we came up with was an intern. So the child of an employee or somebody who had applied for an internship from a local school who was doing work for the executive, but was still a minor and still might be restricted because of his age and his role in the company. The third was a casual observer, a child who might be interested in using the database to find out what movie to watch next weekend. And so in this case, we made up a Disney Kids Club member, a 10-year-old who was just looking for G-rated movies that they could play and wanted to find popular ones. And then finally, the fourth persona is an adult, but a third-party researcher who may pay for access to the database and who might have some restrictions based upon the fact that they're a third party, potentially a competitor, or someone who may not have need for or right to access the larger data set. So we came up with the 4 personas, and then we decided that we would need to apply these ratings criteria that Daniel described to each of the personas. Hey, Daniel, can I nod to you again? You're good at this one.
Absolutely. So you can see, how I think the picture makes it pretty clear, but I'll talk about it for a second, certainly. So you can see how, as Justin alluded, the studio exec essentially has unfettered access with respect to the MPAA ratings. And then if you look back, if you look at the other personas, looking at the intern, they're able to access PG and G, but no access to R or restricted movies. For the Disney Kids fan, and I almost skipped one important distinction here. So starting at the intern, you'll see that there's a little bit of a nuance there, right? So in the case of the studio exec, they can see all of the whole MPAA rating spectrum. There's also no restrictions for each of those. But you'll see, starting with the intern here, we're actually adding in another level of access control. So not only are we restricting their ability to see essentially records in the data. So if I have, in the case of the intern, we say I have no access to R-rated movies. So those rows or those records in the data system are not even visible to that user at all. But we're also applying another layer on top of that based on their role here, which is showing that essentially for the movies that the intern can see for PG and G, they're not able to see financial data, but they can see other data points. And we'll have a visual example of this that Justin will get to in a minute, so you can see how sort of the output of this looks. For the Disney Kids fan, we have the MPAA restrictions there, so they're not able to see R and PG. And then in the case of G-rated movies, which they can see, we're not allowing them to see the actual values for the names, so we're encrypting them in this case. And then for the third-party researcher, if we look back at the MPAA rating, so they're 18 years or older, and so they're able to see all of the records of data. However, we're encrypting the names of the primary actors, the director, the composer, et cetera, and then we're not even allowing them to see any of the financial data. And so you can see how the MPAA ratings actually overlay with the access controls based on their personas or their roles.
Perfect. Thanks, Daniel. So the results of the query, of a hypothetical query, are as follows. In the first case, the executive writes a query. It's the same query the other users might write. And the return is of 6 records, and each of the records is verbose. It includes all of the data. There are no restrictions. And then the second user might write the same query and get fewer results. And we're filtered here by the rating. And then you can see we're also masking or possibly encrypting the financial data, probably masking it because we don't want them to ever be able to get it back. In the third case, the Disney Kids user doesn't get any PG or R-rated movies, only G movies, but you can see that the names of the composer, the director, and the main actors are encrypted. So the child receives the movie title and the adventure genre in this case, and they get the financial results as well, which may or may not be a good idea. Do we really want our 10-year-olds knowing how much money Chicken Little made? That's a value judgment that I think the parents will have to decide. In the fourth case, here we have a third-party researcher, probably like many of us, who try to get access to different open and subscription data services. And in this case, they have unfettered access to the data, but the results are encrypted or masked depending on the content, because we don't want that user to be able to do certain things for particular reasons, like attributing revenue to actors or to directors and so forth. So we think the use case is pretty indicative of the requirements of positive data control. We ran this use case early this year using a tool that we've acquired at SAIC called Coverse, which is a really cool data platform we'd love to talk about with some of you. But I think we spent a few months with a solid team of people going through a number of use cases and a number of environments, and demonstrated that indeed this attribute-based access control and the positive data control framework is implementable and executable based upon our experience. And then I think the question in our minds is, how does this translate to cybersecurity maturity model certification, to the identification and recognition of controlled unclassified information? As Daniel mentioned, structured data is easy. We've all been doing that for a long time. Unstructured data, where some analysts say 70 or 80% of company information is stored, unstructured is different. So how do we recognize images or PDFs or HTML documents, Word documents, and so on? That's the challenge that we're addressing now. So I just want to give credit to the team. Dr. Talbert and Dr. Pullen are the main intellectual drivers here. Dr. Talbert, I think, is, I want to give him special credit. Then we've recruited and engaged a really strong team at SAIC and through the University of Arkansas Little Rock. We want to thank Dr. Yee for his contributions. I sat through his dissertation defense this year. I know Daniel and Dr. Talbert were on his committee, and it was a very persuasive presentation. Sarah Jones she's the Director of Data Governance for SAIC, and I want to give her a nod because she's been shepherding our program for the last 6 months, 6 or 8 months, as we've tried to turn this theory into practice. Chris Campbell is our data program manager who's leading the effort, pulling together all these threads into a program that we can make sure is manageable. Ken is a new member of the SAIC team a few months ago, but Ken jumped right in and is helping us develop and put in place the environment. Curtis Bangert, some of you may know Curtis. Curtis is a master of SAIC's data platform. And Chris Anderson and James True are students of Dr. Talbert, and they've been extremely valuable in helping us develop this solution and put it into practice. So I want to thank everyone. This is contact information for Dr. Talbert, Dr. Pullen, and I. Would love to take your calls. And Robert and Wesley, will turn it back to you, and would love to take questions if that's appropriate.
Yeah, absolutely, Justin. I'll just make an announcement to the audience there that is watching. If you've got any questions, we do have one question I put in the chat box for you already. Justin, you can have a quick look at that. However, I'll just make a a shout out for people there that if you would like to put a question, I can see another questions coming in the Q&A section. Please go to the Q&A section on the right-hand side and enter your question in there, and we will then pass it over to Justin. So, Justin, did you see the first question?
Yeah, I'd like to address that if I could. Yeah, so speaking about positive data control, we used a lot of analogies. And my first analogy was the idea of like a network firewall around an enterprise. The PDC is like a data firewall around controlled data. But actually, this question is really good because that another way to think about positive data control is like an extended form of self-service analytics, right? So in self-service analytics, you have certain data that's set aside, and there are only certain things that you can do with the data. There's certain types of queries that you can run. So in some ways, a self-service system is a positive data control system. There are some differences. And some self-service data might allow you to pull data out and pull it down to your desktop. And if that's not part of the control space, then we wouldn't want that to happen in positive data control without some kind of proper formalization of the export. But yes, I see positive data control as like sort of an extension or an expansion of self-service analytics with, giving, like Daniel was saying, that not only is just users, but it could be developers as well, which is also another challenge with positive data control, like data governance in general is sort of a, cultural change management. I know developers are very accustomed to being able to do anything that they want to, but under positive data control, they also would be under control. They would have broader controls, broader permissions and capabilities, but they would still be under the positive data control. They wouldn't be exempt.
Thank you, John.
Thanks, Dr. Talbot. I just want to add to your concept with more of a business response, and that is that there is a prolific commentary and I guess paradigm in the world where business users who are not technical prefer to have self-service access to data. And I think it's a great marketing pitch to the business users, but I think in the data world, we know that most data is not open, that there are important controls that we need to implement to make sure that the right users get the right data and the wrong users don't get the right data. And so I think I want to take self-service a step further and suggest that self-service is only appropriate in certain use cases. And if you run to a fast food restaurant, you're not allowed to jump behind the counter and really serve yourself. You can just go up to the counter and get the data and the food they'll serve you. So just want to be careful. I think self-service is a great marketing pitch for BI and reporting companies. But I think we need to curate and prepare the environment so that they can manage and access the data that is appropriate for their persona. I did see your second question.
Yeah, there was a question. Yeah, it was just, I sent it only to you, but I think you can read that. And then the other ones, I've opened it up to the group. But if you want to take number 2, Justin.
Sure. And the question is, where can I find additional information on positive data control? And I think I've put up our contact information here. Dr. Talbert is at the University of Arkansas Little Rock, and he's working with us at SAIC. Daniel and I are at SAIC, and we'd enjoy a chance to discuss or further pursue this concept if you're interested and if you have an academic or a professional interest. But I want to go to question 3, and are we engaging business leaders in this framework? Absolutely, yes. And I'll start with that, and then I'll hand it off to Dr. Talbert and Daniel. But this doesn't happen without full business engagement, and we're doing that at SAIC and with some of our customers. It turns out some of our customers have some of the very same challenges that we described, and they're seeing things from a business point of view. And rarely, I would say, is a data solution like this an IT problem. This is really a business framework. And so we've been making the case to our management teams, in particular in the case of the cybersecurity maturity model certification and the sort of identification and so-called tagging of controlled and classified information. These are business problems, and we are working with the various business partners at SAIC and our customers to help them find solutions to those business problems. These are not pure IT solutions by any stretch of the imagination. So our engagement and our funding comes from customers and internal resources who have challenges with data controls and with data access and true curated self-service. Dr. Talbert, I don't know if you want to talk a bit about the business engagement piece.
Just to remember that the positive data control is part of is automating data governance. As we know, data governance in a good data governance program, you want the business leaders to be accountable for data, and I think one of the greatest benefits in my experience of data governance implementation is just to get business talking to IT. We often overload IT and think that they're, accountable for everything just because the data is sitting in their system. So, yeah, I think, for anything to be successful around data, you have to engage business.
And then, sorry. Thanks,
yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, there's another question that come up, Justin.
I see that, and I think the three of us can probably address it. I'll start, and then Dr. Talbert and Dr. Pullen, please feel free to jump in. Real world is exactly what we're addressing now at SAIC with internally and with some of our customers. And I mentioned CMMC. If you're not familiar, it's probably worth a quick search on DuckDuckGo to see what you can find about CMMC and NIST 800, 171, and 172. There are some good resources out there that describe those two requirements and standards. But I'd say that in the real world, across a large organization, I've worked with a number of big banks and corporations in a number of sectors, in high-tech manufacturing, finance, and now in systems integration. And what I'd say is that, like many organizations, we have hundreds of thousands of data elements in the enterprise, and probably tens or even hundreds of millions of unstructured files and documents that can take many forms. And we need to, and we are controlling these now using the positive data control framework. This requires that architecture that Daniel described, which includes extremely robust and real-time active metadata management and cataloging. It implies very granular, fine-grained control over the transformation frameworks. So everything from ETL jobs to calculations in spreadsheets using APIs to data sources, including internal and external market data sources. But it's that framework that Daniel described that gives us the capability to, in the real world, manage documents and data in structured database systems, in Office 365, cloud-based environments, OneDrive, and in the classic SharePoint or shared folders in network file systems. So the framework, we are using the framework in this way. And if you come back in a year, if you don't reach out to us before then, we will walk you through our solution and the capabilities of that solution to manage all of the structured and unstructured data in the enterprise.
Any feedback from the other panelists on that one? Because that was the last question.
I want to jump in really quickly. So I think there's sort of two issues in that question, right? So I think the ad hoc analysis of using Excel files and general, sometimes people call it shadow IT, right? I think that's almost a separate governance issue. I guess what I'm getting is there's larger data governance considerations around that, that we're not specifically addressing or talking about. I think you still need an effective data governance program, and positive data control is really just a tool in the tool belt to help manage events like that, and especially around, we talked about unstructured documents. And so, it doesn't resolve the issue of people create Excel files off on their machines, and they come up with different definitions for business terminology and stuff. And there's other tools that are critical. Certainly, positive data control does help you understand and identify when those documents are created, though.
Thank you, Daniel. Just do one last question, for our community there that is watching this. If you have any final questions, you can put that in, and everyone knows where to go to reach you, Justin, and Dr. Talbert and Daniel as well.
Absolutely. And we'd look forward to chatting with anyone in the conference who's interested in discussing the idea, or who would like to join us or talk about how we can come to this group next year and describe the solution.
Excellent, excellent. Well, Justin, again, many thanks indeed for presenting to the MIT CDOIQ Symposium this year. We really appreciate it. And we will cut to commercial and let you guys go to the next session. Thanks very much indeed.
Thanks, Robert.
Everyone.
Okay. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.